Uh, we've got two speakers today. We've got Andy Higginbotham from Kingston University of London. He's going to go first, and then we've got Dottie. I will embarrass myself and exasperate her by saying I never know how to pronounce a surname because I never learned languages. Dottie, can you say how to pronounce your surname?
Actually, it's Guerrero, and it's a Spanish surname, and in English it means warrior. So I love my name.
Okay, I will massacre it if I try to pronounce it. So please accept my apologies, and I shall probably just stick to Dottie or Dorothy because uh, I know that massacring other people's languages is one of my strong points. And then we'll have our break. I've got some questions which I'm minded to put, and then I'd ask you to respond through the chat. I'm not going to try and use the breakout rooms facility. It strikes me that's one cock up too many, um, and that would be pushing our luck. So first of all, let's get going. And can we please have the opening presentation from Andy Higginbotham, who's Associate Professor at Kingston University, London, where he teaches on slavery and emancipation. Um, and then he's been described as the intellectual end of campaigning, which is no bad thing. And I discovered only this afternoon that he features in a video, which I'll be sharing a link at the end. In his prefatory stuff to us, uh, he said that he was going to talk about Biden's four crises. I have to confess that I didn't know what Biden's four crises were, but I've since found out. So we'll see how we go. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do a bit of a mashup. So the Biden's four crises were when he accepted the nomination at the Democrat convention in the US to be the presidential candidate. And he was saying basically, we've got the crisis of racism, Black Lives Matter, we've got the crisis of COVID, we have the economic crisis, and we have climate change crisis. So I can't do all of them. But they are all interconnected, and if there's one thing I would agree with him, which is that they do all need addressing, and it is very hard to separate them actually. So I just want to talk about this in the context of making the argument that we have to think of our own country, Britain, as still being an imperialist country. So I'm going to start off just by the significance of these statues. Which I'm sure everybody knows about, the pulling down of Colston in Bristol, and then the focus on Cecil Rhodes and later other statues. There has been a debate about the pulling down of statues. I mean, I think they well deserve to be pulled down. But I also think it's important to look at the structures behind the statues, because actually all these figures are being celebrated for a reason. I mean, the statues weren't put up immediately after these fellows died. They were put up later for a very definite reason, which is to maintain the continuity and the legitimacy of an imperial project. And I think from where we are in Britain, we need to think of all these crises in terms of what we think about British imperialism. Now, I'm just trying to move my slides on, and there we go. If you think of Colston, just take him as the example, the slave trader and owner in Bristol whose statue was pulled down. It is a personal issue. I mean, he did own a lot of slave ships, but it's more than that. He was also the head of the Royal Africa Company, which was responsible for much more slavery than one person was. But even at a higher level of generality than that, it's not only just institutional, it's systemic. In other words, it wasn't when the Royal African Company lost its monopoly, the slave trade continued, and it was well established as absolutely part of Britain's rise as a major power in the world. And the book on the left, which I do get my students to read, encourage them to read, is a very key text on this by Eric Williams called Capitalism and Slavery. It's a very readable book. I'm sure many of you know it already, where Eric Williams just explains, how all the profits coming from slavery, the profits actually fueled the Industrial Revolution and Britain's leading role in the world. So this is really the foundation point of where we are today. And I'm just going to rehearse that a bit more. My computer's been very slow to respond to moving on the slides. I'll have to factor that in. I'll do my best. We're going to have a problem, I think. But this bit I didn't test beforehand. We tested just about everything else. It's just not moving at the moment. Oh dear. That is a real problem, actually. I'm really sorry. Just bear with me one more minute. I'll try to get them to move on. I might even go without slides if I need to. All right. The other big statue, Christopher Columbus. He has been pulled down in the United States and various places. He still stands in London, by the way. Not yet pulled down in London. Christopher Columbus has his historical role has moved from being a hero to a villain, quite rightly. But even then, the extent of his villainy is still being uncovered, I would say. It's not only that he was a conquistador and murdered, basically, a lot of indigenous people, which he did. You can read his letters, his intent to do so from early on. But also, and this is less well known, that he was actually a slaveholder. He married into a Portuguese family of slave owners. And again, if you read the record with this knowledge in mind, you can also see quite a strong amount of intent, not only to discover the Americas or some new lands over there, but to subject them to slavery regime. I mean, the slave holdings of Western Europe, Portugal, and Italy actually in particular, moved island by island from the Mediterranean into Madeira and other islands in the Atlantic. And they were stepping stones to the imposition of slavery attempted on indigenous people, and when that failed against Africans. So Columbus is still a really important figure, and when we talk about a world in crisis, it is worthwhile taking this sort of like historical framing step back. We are talking about a 500-year historical memory of indigenous people and African descendant people, of what they were subject to as a consequence of Columbus project. And this really does still shape the world we're in today. I want to make the case that this is still a really important, it's not only sort of like history for history's sake, or what's the word, breastbeating or sackcloth. We are part of a privileged nation here in Britain, but it's more than that. It's actually what it means for today. And once again, I got this problem with the slides moving on. I think what I want to do, every slide, I'm going to try and move it on as soon as I get into it, and hope that the time lag will meet my speaking pace. I've never come across this problem before. You can see what I say here. There's in Spanish school books. Actually, I lived in Spain for a short time, by the way, and I saw the school books which my kids were at primary school were being given, right? And they refer to Columbus, and this was now just after 2000, right? They refer to Columbus as being a genius, and his genius was that he was able to bring slavery to the Americas. That he realized you need slave labor to run the colony was the point of his genius. And I'm still struggling with my slides. I'm really sorry about this, actually. It might be that this is going to actually stop us too much. So here we go. I've got it now. I finally got the way to do it. Okay, thank you. Cecil Rhodes should be the next one to fall. He has fallen in Cape Town, at least at the university, but not in Oxford. Now, in terms of his legacy, it's enormously important to this day in terms of the City of London and what we're going to come on to, which is the role of multinational corporations. Now, apart from these sort of incidents and figures, the best systemic analysis of this whole legacy of colonialism is still Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Related Studies. And it's a really straightforward and basic point that colonialism wasn't only an expression of racial attitudes, which certainly was, but it was about exploitation. and the motive of exploitation was fundamental to the enslavement and colonization projects. Now, it didn't end with colonization. This is the next crucial point. Britain played a really significant role in many parts of the world in maintaining economic control of countries, even after they became politically independent. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1960 is the absolute pivotal classical case of this. He fought against the Belgian occupation of his country. He was a leader of a real popular movement, but against the Belgian wishes, he told them that they should leave fully, not just go in form but in content. In other words, all the mining exploitation which they'd set up was no longer welcome, that workers should be paid a decent wage. African workers were awfully exploited under colonialism, and as a result of that, the CIA, United States, France, Belgium and Britain all conspired to have him assassinated because they wanted a different type of independence where they kept economic control. And I would say the last half century, this conspiracy and systematic attempts to maintain neo-colonial forms is crucially important to understanding our position in the world. Another very famous example which comes after this is Lonrho Corporation, which used the independence period basically to corrupt. It was a corrupter, professional corrupter, Tiny Rowland, to corrupt countries all over Africa to continue making deals which saw the wealth of their countries being exported to countries like ours, Britain. The ending of apartheid was another classic case where there was a deal made. The great Nelson Mandela, and he was a great man in terms of his principles and the honourable stand he took against apartheid. But at the same time, it is also true that he made a deal with big business. The condition of the transition was that the mining corporations and big capital and white privilege based on that capital would remain intact. So what we had, Mandela and the ANC made a deal, and the British also orchestrated the deal because on both sides saw it would be better to have a reform transition than a bloodbath or revolution. Now this becomes quite important for the next step. All these things lead up to something, okay? And the next step is, oh, I've got my slide issue now, is that many of the big corporations that were based in South Africa are now based in London, especially the big mining corporations. So what you have is London is, along with Canada, a major international hub for international mining corporations. So what we have in terms of global extractivism is a financial platform here in London and operations all over the world, a global apartheid. The three corporations in the biggest coal mine in Atlantic Basin, which is in Cerrejón in Colombia, they're continuing this. It's basically an enclave of foreign multinational control. The railway line being specially built, all the coal goes out of the country, local communities and wildlife being destroyed, rivers being diverted. Tigrillo there is basically dead because of no water. And right now the workers at this multinational corporation on strike because under the collapse of coal demand with COVID, the corporation is pushing back on the workers to cut their standards, and the workers are on strike against what they call the death shift, which would be, I think, 7 times 12-hour shifts, one after another, and they're saying we're just not going to do that. British London-based corporations at the centre of it. So the next aspect is, so coal clearly is a major factor in generating global warming. The other one, of course, is oil and gas. And so this is what I want to say now, that we are already in a very deep catastrophe. I mean, it's really sort of like everybody's experience, but in particular of various incredibly widespread indicators in the global south, in South Asia, in Africa, in other parts of Asia as well. The climate change is upon us and is deeply affecting already social cohesion and societies in many parts of the world. It's already there. And again, you know, we see in the news about, you know, the Arctic and the Antarctic. They are already melting. We are already very close to points of inflection in terms of the survival of the planet. And in the meantime, the reality is, even after Paris and so on, the reality is that the industries which are the main generators of greenhouse gases are still expanding their production. Coal is still expanding. Well, coal is just still expanding, right? But oil and gas are definitely still expanding, okay? You can see here in this slide, oh, actually coal is just dipped. Okay, fair enough. It's dipped by 0.7%, okay? Now, overall, fossil fuels are still expanding in their production. Again, even after COVID, this is the case, right? Now, these two things come together. Britain's place in the world, if you look at government reports, and all the main political parties share in this discourse, by the way, it's framed in terms that we contribute just over 1% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And this is framed as actually quite a strong success story. And there have been changes. So there has been a shift out of coal into gas and into wind generation. Fracking has been held up. So that you know, the pressure from the public has had an effect. But overall, I would say this is false pride. And there are two reasons for this, right? One is that an awful lot of the emissions which we are in the end responsible for are because of the imported production. So China's production generates greenhouse gases, which we consume basically. But even more than that, the first point was made by Greta Thunberg, by the way, when she came here. She's quite right to make the point. But there's a further point, which is, if you look at the big mining and oil corporations, it's a game changer in terms of degrees of responsibility. These are the biggest mining corporations in the world. Similar picture with oil. Now, if you take their responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, you end up with these figures here. Now, Britain's domestic emissions are something like just under 400, okay? So this is something like 3,000. So in other words, British corporations, operations overseas, are responsible for 7 or 8 times more greenhouse gas emissions than the whole of the UK put together. Okay, that's why this imperial aspect of extractivism is so important, for us to take responsibility in terms of a global fight against climate change. These are the major oil majors. What the oil majors have been saying, by the way, I think you can see this light blue line, is that they are reducing their Scope 1 emissions, right? Scope 1 emissions are the greenhouse gases which are burned off, or the carbon emissions which are emitted in production of the oil and the gas, okay, gas flaring, if you like, and stuff like that. But look how low proportion they are to the overall responsibility, which is the end use, Scope 3 of the products which they're extracting. This one is from the Financial Times. It shows just how important, Dutch Shell is basically British Dutch and BP. These two companies amongst the 5 biggest oil corporations in the world, private oil corporations. And you can see how big their reserves are, right? And that's why they are the biggest corporations. They're able to buy these reserves into the future. Now, in terms of how positions about how to deal with this, what the British establishment is doing is, we know it's saying no reduction of global emissions by 2050. Within that overall sort of narrative, which won't be enough to do anything, by the way, hardly. And principal player is the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and he's now a special advisor or reporter for the UN on climate change. And he was already playing this role when he was head of the Bank of England. He was also head of some international bodies, which is the solution from above, from the top, right, is to control the transition in ways are suitable to finance capital, and in fact are led by finance capital, right? They have 2 major concerns. One is, because the catastrophe is already hitting, there have been an awful lot of insurance cases. So insurance gone up, and insurance markets have to pay out a lot more money. But the bigger concern, and we're beginning to see this with COVID as well, is the so-called stranded assets case, where the big corporations are sitting on assets which actually the market means that they can't make full use of. So it's kind of like out of self-interest that they won't be able to be so profitable. So we need to make a controlled transition out of an unprofitable fossil fuel sector into a more profitable renewable sector. And there are price changes. Renewables costs are coming down. Price of oil and coal has also been going down. So there has been some movement from one sector to another on pure profit making grounds. But the rate of change is completely orders of magnitude less than what is actually needed in order to cope with the existing crisis. So what Carney is basically doing is appealing to big investors to hold corporations account for reporting on their emissions and so on. This is green finance, which is not only that capitalism is part of the solution, it is that capitalism is the solution, according to this point of view, right? Right. There are also a load of techno fixes being proposed, which we probably don't have time to go into. I'm sure many of you know more about these than I do, actually. Now, when Greta Thunberg was at Davos earlier in the year, she put forward 3 positions which had been agreed in some discussion, which I think are fine, absolutely fine, that there should be no more investment in fossil fuels, there should be no more subsidies in fossil fuels, and that there should be an exit from fossil fuels. I actually think if you look at the real problem, we need to take a couple of steps further, right? Which is, why do these fossil fuel corporations exist? Okay, I mean, they were born in imperialism. They are completely destructive of the planet, and they are completely unaccountable except to their shareholders and financiers, right? They should be dismantled. There's no, they have no sort of, it's going to be them or us. It's a zero-sum game in that respect, okay? And secondly, I mean, what about these big assets, the financial asset fund like BlackRock and so on? Again, they are actually the ones who are nudging in some direction, but I mean, who controls them? I mean, who, you know, their power is purely financial, and it's no way accountable to the people of this world, let alone the planet. So, if you like, that's my criticism of the established view. I mean, I think that all over the world, Roberta Castells is well known, and rightly so. I mean, the boat on her name was there in Oxford Circus by XR, and it's a good thing they did in remembering her. But what we should also remember is, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of community and environmental defenders who are being assassinated. In Colombia alone, there are hundreds of people who get assassinated for fighting against coal mines, for fighting against other forms of extractivism. And so the general thesis that I was saying earlier about neocolonialism is still a reality today. So people are in the global south, all over the world, are fighting these extractivist projects which are destroying their communities and their immediate environments. And it's really quite fragmented. It's a pattern all over the world, right? But these are all fighting sort of central power who work in close alliance with the local states. That's the neocolonial deal. So their alliance is something that we need to strategically counter with our alliance. We absolutely have to support the peoples of the global south who are on the front line against these massive extractive corporations. And this one I really like. This was what happened. I think you remember, obviously before COVID now, but it was the protest at BP. BP must fall. This was in London. And this is what I think, I mean, so I've been talking about trade and investment and big corporations and their impact on the world. And I'm saying they are imperialist. This is economic imperialism. And I'm saying that our strategy for fighting climate change as a crisis has to make dismantling their power absolutely central. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. That's not only answered what's the Biden's four crises, it's given us a good background view to what's going on and also where we've come from. It certainly got me thinking. Dottie, can we now turn to you for your contribution, please? And I should just remind people, Dottie was with us for a webinar with Jubilee Debt Campaign back in May. She's the Head of Policy and Advocacy with Global Justice in London. She's worked internationally and particularly with community groups and with women's groups. And she's also an academic, even if she hasn't yet passed her English test. She is telling us about having done a PhD in English. And she's a guest lecturer in MA development programs at universities in Asia and Germany. So over to you now, Dottie. And if you can aim for, say, 5 to 8, then we'll have a chance to have a little comfort break.
Okay, that will be perfect. And thank you, Stephen and Andy, for such a brilliant first presentation, because I think it will complement of what I will say as well. What I will be sharing is the connection between ongoing and historic struggles when we talk of climate justice, or when we talk of what must be done to address climate change. At the moment, actually, climate justice campaigners are saying we are faced with the crisis of everything. So we're facing COVID-19 crisis, a global pandemic, but at the same time, the climate crisis is still there. Although for a few months, it was not the focus, but before that, we were talking about climate emergency. And I noticed as well that in the last 2 years, many climate activists and campaigners are talking about connecting the issues between the global south, or the injustices in the global south, and the need to work on climate justice. For many activists, especially those that look at climate linked with a crisis of the economic system, or those with the systemic approach to talking about climate issues. The climate crisis is just one aspect of the fight for global justice. It is important. It is connected to many things. It's connected to the issues of development, the economic model, with security, with the human relations as well. Because the problem with global warming or climate change is that it is not just an environmental issue. It is a social issue, wherein we have to address the problem between your relationships between humans. And that's where you look at the class and race dynamics and gender dynamics, and at the same time the injustices between the relationship of humans and nature. So when at this point I have identified some of the important fights that climate justice groups and organizations are working on. At this point, I would put the COVID-19 recovery and global reset. What do we need to do on this aspect? And many of those who are addressing this issue, movements and organizations globally, are saying that we should not talk about resilience, and at the same time about going back to normal, because that normal is death. So it is time we should use this moment to prioritize justice, sustainability, human rights, and the protection of livelihoods and the planet. At the same time, this crisis of everything are rooted on capitalist, patriarchal, and racist system designed for capital accumulation and neoliberal corporate-led globalization. Because when we look at when we say systemic critique on the climate crisis, then we will see that the model of development is actually a model of maldevelopment. And in the global south, it's also what many movements call the resubordination of the south, because much of what Andy mentioned about the continuation of resource robbery, the continuation of multinational corporations that can go anywhere, anytime, and do anything with very little that governments can do to stop them or regulate them is indeed a big problem. That is one reason why for Global Justice Now, we also look at the role of corporations and the fact that as long as governments, or as long as there is an asymmetry of power between corporations, the states, and communities, we will not be able to solve climate change, because the corporations will always have primacy over our rights and over the health of our environment and worker standards and all the social standards that we are trying to protect and promote. At the same time, in many, many countries, one of the things that, including here in the UK, one of the things that COVID-19 showed is that there is more need in society than what the states are ready and able to provide. And so there's a need to further push the state to play a fundamental role in guaranteeing our rights and environmental justice. And in many of the global south, countries in the global south, they are pushing for issues or for climate justice, and at the same time also addressing or calling the need to change the governments, because at this point especially, wherein we have a global trend of you have the right gaining power and getting elected and being seen as populists. Many of the countries in the global south are faced with the issue of the decreasing political space also to organize and mobilize and criticize the government failures and the government's lack of vision when it comes to addressing both the climate crisis and COVID-19. There are also a big call for no bailout for transnational corporations and big corporations, especially those most responsible for the systemic crisis, such as fossil fuel, mining companies, agribusinesses, airlines, and companies based in tax havens. In 2008, we have seen this happen, that instead of solving recession and addressing the needs of the people, it was the companies that received bailout. And at the moment, it is happening again. If we would look at the stocks of the big companies, especially those that are those that are in the fossil fuel industries, their stock are rising again after a glut in the last 5 months. And that is not because it is natural. It's not the fact that people or investors are getting confidence again to invest on them, but it is because they're receiving money from corporations. And here in the UK, a big portion actually of the stimulus package is to bail out big corporations. So I will park that for the moment, and we can go back to that later. Another fight that is globally as well, on trade especially, is the inclusion of investment chapters in new trade treaties. And then I think at the moment our crucial fight is on the US-UK trade treaty, although it doesn't have ISDS. But the thing is, this trade partnership could be the blueprint for future trade partnership that the UK will enter into. There are already, this UK-US trade treaty, over the recess, it went through a third round of negotiations, very secretive negotiations, and tomorrow there will be a next round due to kick off on trade. And in terms of another flip of that, another side of that coin as well, is that when we talk of investment state dispute settlement, it's not just a problem for countries in the South. it is also a problem for countries in the north because now, excuse me, many there's an increasing cases that is targeting countries in Europe of corporations who see that their profits will be in trouble if governments will, for example, regulate mining or stop the coal use. For example, the Netherlands is faced with an ISDS case because the government issued a memorandum that it will no longer use coal by 2030. So coal companies have now put a case on an ISDS case against the Netherlands. So imagine if a developed country can face that. That is just the beginning, but in many developing countries, countries like Indonesia face this problem when they banned or when they tried to regulate palm oil. Other countries Bangladesh also had this problem when they are trying to regulate the use of coal. So that's one set of issues that is connected to the global reset, or how do we look beyond COVID-19 and what the kind of society we wanted to have in case we get out or pull ourselves out of this global pandemic. There's also a north-south dynamics in the question, on the question of climate justice, as what Andy has mentioned. If in the big picture, in terms of trade and investment, you already have this problem of the northern country with the instruments through transnational corporations that are still in the south, did not actually leave, still investing, still doing the polluting and destruction of the environment there. In the Conference of Parties or the climate negotiation, we have seen how the negotiation actually is not solving the issue of balancing greenhouse gas emission. And that is the reason why many of the campaigners, especially in the South, are saying that this whole negotiation is about an encounter or a talk negotiations between former colonial powers that are trying to assert their dominance and the formerly colonized nations that are trying to resist them. So we could see that in the various negotiation in terms of climate finance, in terms of these mitigation schemes, in terms of adaptation. So it has always been a very painful negotiation between the Annex 1 countries, or the 49 richest countries, and the G77 and China countries. I mentioned earlier that many of those that are looking at the issue of trade and investment linked with climate call it the robbery of nature. It is also because if you look historically, as what Andy mentioned, the wealth of the North was built at the backs of slavery and robbery of nature extraction from the global South. So what are the Southern countries doing? Many of the movements are also doing and building South-South solidarity. And at the same time, practicing and building and strengthening reciprocal solidarity between themselves and trying to push their governments to have more in league with each other than be pawns of the rich countries. Unfortunately, if we look at the COP as well, and if we look at some of the delegations or country delegations that attend the negotiation, some of the advisors of a number of Southern countries are actually transnational, lobbyists from transnational corporations. So unfortunately, some Southern countries also do not behave as what they should be, or do not behave like Southern countries, because their interests are dictated by their cushioned relationship, or the leaders' cushioned relationship with corporations from the North. I can also go back to that when it comes to the questions portion. So what is actually needed between not just South-South, but also movements globally is build a common understanding and analysis of all forms of oppression, their interconnectedness, as well as the need to tackle them all globally. It is a debate before within Extinction Rebellion about the fourth call of solidarity with the Global South. I know that a lot of XR members or chapters agree to that, and then to bring to the fore the question of solidarity with the Global South. And a third issue that I think is also very, very important. This is not ranked by hierarchy or importance, but rather these are all equally important issues that movements that are working on climate and trade and investment are looking at. The pillar of finance is crucial. So apart from the question of climate finance, which by the way is part of the climate negotiation from the common but differentiated responsibilities, in COP15 in Copenhagen, there is an actual commitment from countries, from the Annex 1 countries or from the rich countries, to make available climate finance for southern countries. But unfortunately, of the 49 member countries, only Germany was able to meet that responsibility. The UK is dismally failing in putting up finance that it committed to solve the climate problem. On the other hand, another issue is the cancellation of debt, because if we will see that not just on the current COVID crisis, but also in terms of the pressure for many countries in the Global South to continue welcoming transnational corporations, mining industry, this is because they are hard pressed to earn the foreign currency that they needed for the automatic allocation for debt servicing or financing. And this is one of the old campaigns of Global Justice Now, that the global debt of the Global South debt must be canceled, especially at this point wherein 69 countries are putting more money to pay the debts than prop up their health system. And the principle of climate reparations and ecological debt must be applied. So this is one debate put forward actually in the negotiation by the developing countries, that there must be an acceptance or recognition of the ecological debt of the North to the South, that it's not just the South that are indebted because of all those loans from World Bank and IMF, but it is actually people here in the North that are ecologically indebted to people in the South. Because if we look at the long and historic use of resources and what was mentioned over and over, that the wealth of countries like the UK were accumulated from dispossession and from the backs of slavery and exploitation of southern countries. So in terms of the public finance as well, one of the issues that we monitored in the G20 meetings, 2 meetings of all the central banks and foreign finance ministers, we called on the G20 to end or to cancel the debt, but it seems that it's falling on deaf ears, and then I wrote a blog on that. But also, especially at this point where the economic impacts of the crisis is enormous. Back in April, the IMF said that this could push a lot of countries back to the below poverty level, and again that will open up a lot of problem. One of the crucial, and this would be my fourth issues that movements are calling on and campaigning on, is on energy transition. And before COVID-19, the basic argument is that nationalization could expedite the phasing out of fossil fuels in order to reach climate targets, while ensuring a just transition for workers in coal, oil, and gas corporate industries. Nationalization will also remove the toxic influence of big oil and other large fossil fuel corporations. And there is that legal architecture that countries can use for nationalization to actually happen. The Greenwich University Public Public Services Institute actually have put together cases after cases of successful renationalization and nationalization of assets. And that would, and the argument is that for just transition, especially in many poor countries, it is important that they first own those assets. In South Africa, that's one of the main debates, that how can they think of just transition when all of the mining and extractive companies are owned by the British, by the French, by the Dutch companies still, or partially owned. So there's a massive task also that will require full ownership of refineries, investor-owned utilities, not to mention land. Where will, if a country will say, okay, we will go with renewables and we will have solar panels, where will they, or will they start producing solar panels? Where will they find the land if all of these lands are now owned by the rich and also by foreign companies? So there are formidable challenges on this issue, and that is also one of the key fights in both the negotiation and also in the general climate justice campaigning. When it comes to the investment, it is still very, very unbalanced. That I think $1.8 trillion was invested in the energy sector last year, and this year it might fall a bit, but it will just be maybe 20% decrease. It would still be a lot of money that investors are still putting on the energy sector using fossil fuels than renewable, while at the same time renewable energy is actually getting cheaper, but it's still not, in terms of the priorities of the G20 countries, it's still prioritizing, they're still prioritizing fossil fuel investment, and that includes the UK. So the last two ones I think are crucial, because here the government, our government here is saying that they would push for net zero by 2050, which is too little and too late actually. And this is also a questionable target, because if it has agreed to the Paris Agreement, then you can't do net zero by 2050. Actually, the actual targets, the national targets of the UK is part of the big problem why all the countries that have pledged in COP 21 will actually not get the target. We are still facing a minimum of 3 degrees centigrade warming because of those. And I think Andy has partially touched on this. For climate campaigners here in the UK, the number one assignment for us is actually to show that we are not a world leader on climate, that the UK is far from being a world leader on climate. Historically, the UK is the 5th worst emitter of greenhouse gases. It varies now, maybe 6 or 7, but for a long, long time, it's the 5th worst emitter. The net zero emission goal is it makes a mockery of climate science, and also the need for climate to address climate change. So there's a need to call on this hypocrisy. There's also one of our big campaign in Global Justice Now is the fact that British aid budget is being used to fund fossil fuels. So the city and other UK-based multinationals and British multinationals are driving the climate breakdown by funding all this deadly extractivism in the global south, and like what Andy mentioned, with a whole number of climate activists being killed by governments in the global south that are receiving this funding. So we need actually to reduce our emission without offsetting. And that is where all these false solutions come in. All of the parties in the last election talk about carbon capture and storage, and of different dimensions or different variations of that, which is a big problem because CCS actually is not a solution. It will just open roads for corporations to have to present themselves as solutions. In fact, the fossil fuel corporations have done that for so many years. It is putting billions of dollars and pounds to make themselves, to present themselves as the solutions to the problems. I think I will stop there, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Dottie. You've touched a whole raft of issues there, which we've got positions on and campaigned on in the past and in the future with global justice. Could I just ask everybody, please, unless you violently don't want to use the chat. I hadn't twigged quite how few people have been doing this. Please start thinking about questions you'd like us to look at, put them in the chat or the Q&A. If you don't want to be identified, then please make them anonymous. But could we please do that? And at this point, I thought we could all do with a bit of a stretch. When I was a teacher, we had to do exercises. The kids used to laugh at this, but it actually woke them up and it stopped them wriggling around in other ways. I've tried, I've got some music which you may or may not recognize, and I'm not going to try and do it the high-tech way, I'm going to try and do it the low-tech way. There's 3 questions I put in the chat for starters, but you don't have to deal with them. We're not going to try and put people into breakout rooms, that's maybe a step too far, but could I invite us all to spend, say, 5 minutes, which you can go to the loo, listen to the music, and don't go home, or you're at home, don't run away, and think of where what we can do and what's been important to you out of what we've heard. Okay, so please use the chat, and here's some music.
Step by step along this march can be won, and be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Step by step the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Step by step along this march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. drops of water turn a mill. Singly on, step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch. Singly on, and by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill. Singly on, singly on.
Мама, всегда плачет.
People may have recognised that song. It was Pete Seeger. There are other versions of it available, but I thought that was one where the banjo might come over the sound system without being too different. Please have a little think about those questions, or better still, questions from your own. I see Violaine, if that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. She's come up with one. I think that's a very useful one. Perhaps our panelists would like to reflect on that in a couple of minutes, but please pop in your other thoughts and other questions. The topic of reparations is always one which strikes me as being hard work to sell. Not saying it's not morally right, I'm just saying it's hard work to sell. And I wonder about the place of vested interest in trying to bring about solutions, even if it's secondary to justice. Be interested to hear people's thoughts, either there or in the Q&A. Okay, let's start this one rolling. Please come up with your reflections on reflections, if that's what you'd like to do. And I'm going to, Violaine, you haven't said that you don't want to be identified. I'm going to unmute you. If you'd like to talk, I think it's allowing you to talk now. I'll let you have the floor if you like.
Hiya, hi everybody.
Well, would you like to be seen?
Yeah, why not?
Oh, well, sorry, I don't know if I can do this. Hello, here we go. Sorry, this is a bit more. Oh dear me. Well, you better start talking. If I can get your face on it, well, we're winning. Sorry, this is maybe a bit beyond my pay grade, my scope. Off you go. Start talking, please.
Okay, so yeah, sorry. Thanks for your interventions. I do apologize. I arrived late actually, so I missed a few of them. Family reason and commitments, I'm afraid. I was just wondering how. Yeah, indeed, you can see that in the question. I was just wondering how to link all of these questions to young people, really, because it seems to happen to me that apart from there is a big desire from the young people to get active, but I also have a feeling that at the moment this is a climate issue and global justice, despite the fact that we had a lot of demonstrations with the Black Lives Matter movement and the rest of it. There's a little bit of blurry feeling from everybody, and especially amongst young people who feel at a loss in terms of what to do next and what to do with themselves, their own future being uncertain, and how to get them more involved. I'm thinking more maybe about secondary age students or about this age, and I was wondering whether you have some ideas actually how to do that.
Can I just leap in and point out to our speakers that Manchester has had some fairly medium-sized Fridays for the Future school strikes, maybe getting up to 500 people, young people coming in for them. There's one coming up in about 2-3 weeks' time. But in actual fact, many of the young people coming on them have come from outside Manchester. Andy, would you like to leap in?
Yeah, well, I was very pleased to see in the Guardian reports of the young black people who led the Black Lives Matter protests around the UK. I think there's over 300 of them. How they, in their early teenage years, many of them had been involved in the climate protests as well, and they sort of saw that as a stepping stone to their taking responsibility for the later protests. So I agree. I think there's something. I'm not close to it, but from what I can see, is something very big happening amongst young people. It's very welcome. You're very welcome indeed. In my view, there's a gap between that movement, which needs to be filled by, I think, forms of popular education. I mean, I mean it. I mean, how many people know about BP and Shell and the mining corporations around the world? And I think that young people can see a connection there and what we can do. We have a kind of like a medium-term challenge with the fact that the next COP will be in the UK. I'm not sure if they set a date. I know it's going to be sometime next year. And this whole narrative about we are the good guys and, follow our example that Dottie was also referring to, I think is really important that young people are educated and know the real history of Britain, and especially in terms of extractivism. And I think between us, we have a massive challenge to, I saw a really good, my partner showed me a really good series on, I think it's on Vice, it's called Empire of Dirt. It's brilliant. I mean, I think we need more of that kind of stuff. We need to, because I think there is a strong willingness to do something. It's finding what that something is and actually deepening the already, hugely mushrooming knowledge base which people have. I think people know an awful lot what's happening about the environment, I have to say. I think they know less about the political economy of exploitation which is going on in the world, and that's where I think we need to try much harder to make a connection, make an engagement there.
Actually, well, I was reminded that both Andy and I were part of the London Mining Network, and there is a game that they play, the education office.
Yeah, that's very good.
Mining Network have this phone cycle game, because, for example, a mobile phone is, you won't have any teenager who doesn't have a phone. Everybody has a phone, and but they don't know how the phone was made, and so it includes, what is the background of that phone, the materials, the mining included in it, and the exploitation and depths in those mining. So there are those kind of educational activities that that can be used to get young people engaged. And I think that phone cycle game is quite educational and very, very interesting. And I think this is also a fact. It is also a fact that for many young people, the between production and consumption, the middle line, how are products produced, is the missing point, because people don't know how products come about. That every product actually, at the end of it, is some underpaid worker that has to work for 14 hours to produce those products. And at the same time, in terms of, do people still know, because of the global supply chains, people now can no longer trace where everything that they use came from. So I think that could be an important part of educating young people. I would like to do a plug as well, because for the COP26 coalition, which which we are also part of, I mean Global Justice Now, we will be running a speaker series from September 17 every Thursday up to October 22. So there are 6 webinars on everything you wanted to know on the climate issue. So I will put the link here. It's open for everybody, and actually we designed it as a sort of to make people be on the same page about climate and the idea as well, what is the negotiation. The COP26 will be from November 1 to 12, 2021. But before that, there's a lot of activities. There will be a 1 week of webinars, activities, and mass actions in November as well, in lieu of the canceled talks. From November 12 to 16, there will be a lot of activities, and we will all put that in the website for people to know what's happening and where to join.
Thank you very much. It struck me also, Global Justice, because it doesn't really have a youth wing, tends to produce things which are fairly heavy. So we've got this briefing, which is downloadable, available. You should all know about the wonderful Nick book, which you can get for free as electronic copies. And this is not a heavy read, although it has got footnotes. And what I couldn't find, because I gave away my last one, I think on Saturday at a XR demonstration, was that Global Justice has produced an illustrated comic book type discursus, which doesn't have footnotes, but does open up the issues. That's downloadable off the website under resources, I think it is, but you can get hard copies. And certainly I was giving it to young people on the strikes and saying, you may be woke, but you may have some friends who aren't. Leave it in the loo. And some of them said they'd take it to school. So there are things that I think can be used. And certainly in my experiences working as a secondary school teacher, there may be PHSE lessons, I don't know if they still call them that by that title, which the teacher may quite accept propaganda as a way of stimulating conversation. And same thing with English. I worked in a secondary school where we used to look at emotive language, and this is a good source of authentic texts. So thank you very much for that on that. Suzanne's asked us a question. Suzanne, can I bring you in, please, on this one? Let's see if I can, okay, I've got you talking, Suzanne. Would you like to talk?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I was thinking about from both of the presentations, the idea that there are people on the front line, perhaps just practically with their bare hands, fight against this climate and ecological emergency and economic exploitation, and the climate defenders and people fighting for economic justice are dying and being killed. Is there any way that they can get their voices heard in international forums? Are there any examples of this? And I think Dottie mentioned emerging South-South solidarity systems. I wondered if there are any examples to share of these.
You go.
Okay, yeah, for the one example of the regional African regional network is on women or women in mining, and it is a network that has affiliated 14 countries in Africa, and these are women miners and leaders from mining communities that came together. And there are different working groups within it. There's one on energy and climate. There's on food security and climate. So I will paste the website here. That's for women, African women on focus on mining, climate, and trade issues. In Asia, actually as early as the 1990s, there is this Asian Regional Network for New Alternatives, which is like the mother of all the multi-issue or multi-campaign. There is actually also an Asia-Europe People's Forum, wherein Global Justice Now is part of the International Organizing Committee. And there is a climate cluster or climate working group on that. And we are hoping that for COP26, we can bring some of the community leaders from Asia to be in Glasgow for next year. So we are trying fundraising and trying to make that possible. For within the COP26 coalition, where we also have a global assembly that we started 2 months ago. So it happens every six weeks as well. This is to prepare groups from the Global South as well that are planning to come to the UK to get, to get their voices in the planning of the coalition as well, because we will have a people's forum or people's platform. We don't have a name yet, but there will be a parallel place in Glasgow where all these simultaneous workshops, big assemblies on climate will happen during the negotiation. I will put on the chat some of these websites.
Thank you.
I mean, I work in really quite relatively small solidarity groups with Colombia and Latin America, and also, other international solidarity activism. And we have to rebuild the movement. I think it's the sort of big social forums did occur, and now we're kind of like rebuilding. So, I mean, London Mining Network is an excellent positive example of a platform for communities from the Global South. I mean, just to say, COVID is awful in India now, in Latin America. If you go on the FT Financial Times website, you'll see 45% of the world's deaths are in Latin America right now. I mean, it's just atrocious. So, we will, for example, be doing something on the 10th of October with Latin American communities here in London about COVID in Latin America. Because it's not known. You're quite right. I mean, the real stories are barely getting out. Sheffield Cuba Solidarity did a very good series. I think it's probably still on YouTube with voices from Latin America. And, it is a slight, what's the word? Not perverse, but an odd thing that we can come together through Zoom, etc. at the moment. And I mean, I wouldn't, what's the word? I think that these small efforts are very important. I mean, I think rebuilding a movement is step by step, rebuilding trust, because, people do, when they meet in conferences and so on, they can make contact, which lasts a long time. We don't quite have that process right now. But the electronic means we have, we should definitely be consciously trying to support people. And I would definitely say, try to make it as a strategic focus, the COP thing. I mean, just to add what I'm saying, I would love to see young people picketing BP and Shell petrol stations because they think it's wrong what these oil companies are doing. So I'm not sure, there's woke and woke. I mean, young people also have to toughen up a bit, because XR are beginning to get hit now quite hard. And we're moving from one stage to another. A lot of people are arrested, and it's now quite clear that the police are going for people who, they're harder, and things will get tougher because what we're actually saying does challenge very deeply held vested in economic interests. And so there's an education of struggle, if I can put it like that, which is also needed. I mean, it's a reality of we ain't going to do this without shaking up and really hurting the establishment.
Thank you very much, both Andy and Dottie. So we'll maybe just hope to try and amplify those voices in wherever they can appear. Yeah, thank you.
I just share the fact that I'd say XR rally last Monday, I think it was, St. Peter's Square. There was a GP from Didsbury, which is a fairly well-heeled area of Manchester. and he had formed a GP's cell for exile or something, and they produced stickers and had been. He said that they'd, with young people, they had stuckered, if that's the right word, 50 plus petrol stations around Manchester. Now that's a fairly easy activity, but it's a start, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I remember on the march watching a young man who was obviously being the naughtiest he'd ever been in his life with a spray can. He was only spraying the pavement and things, and when the march stopped, he whipped it out of his coat, sprayed, and when the march started moving, he went on even without he hadn't finished his spray. I think there is this issue of authoritative pushback and violence. In Manchester, I didn't see much of it last week, not compared to London. But on the other hand, I don't think the things that were being done in Manchester were quite as much in your face. When we went to the BBC on Saturday, they poured several litres of beetroot juice over some steps. It wasn't going to damage anything that you couldn't wash off with a garden hose. There may have been a bit of spray paint around the city centre, but there's an awful lot of spray paint around the city centre anyway. But I think there is that awakening going on in some young people locally. Thank you very much for that. I'd just like to raise the question, and maybe only 1 minute from both of you. What do you think we can do to try and shake through the media logjam on this? At the moment it's COVID, and COVID. Mainstream Evening News letter page has been locked in a spat over the city council and climate denial. Not the city council climate denial, but there have been climate deniers who've been pushing back against climate emergency Manchester. And how do we actually break into this narrative? Dottie?
I think all the discussions are. I mean, there's a lot of agreement that we do have a pandemic to face, but at the same time, the climate change is our long-term problem. And then also, this may not be the last pandemic we're facing. There will be future pandemics, and the future pandemics, and many of them will also be a correlation between humans increasing entrance into forest, and that's why there are all these kind of pandemics. So it is important, I think, to focus that all these issues are interconnected. Even COVID-19, many are saying that there is a question there of consumption that is pushing the environment to its limits.
Again, I really do strongly agree with that. I mean, there's been 2 or 3 quite good articles now about how destruction of natural habitats is accelerating the transmission from other species to human species. I mean, and that's going to accelerate. I mean, what's happening in the Amazon is an acceleration of that right now. And also, I'm not quite sure what the papers are saying, but I think it's entirely justified that people right now are, I mean, I'm worried about the health and safety. We're in the midst of a big push by the government to put a lot more lives at risk, basically, because they see the only agency being the employers. I mean, there's no real process of consultation where I work. So it's very legitimate. I think maybe we can try and connect it in a sense of health and safety, our health and safety, and the planet's health and safety. I mean, I know that's a bit, not a very developed argument, but I mean, there is a connection. I just very quickly, there was a question in the chat early on. Toxic assets it's about context, between toxic assets and stranded assets. So we know that the subprime crisis, which triggered the last big financial crisis was, you know, in terms of low-cost housing. And really stranded assets are assets which don't earn a profit, but it's just in a different context now that they're being talked of. But in economic terms, yeah, they're quite similar.
I'm putting on the chat the illustrated publication that Stephenson mentioned, The Case for Climate Justice. This can be downloaded from our website, and also if you contact us, you can also order copies of the booklet. And I think this is a very, very informative 16-page illustration. I mean, illustrated discussion, which is not just climate, but also it touch on trade, it touch on history of colonialism and racism and migration issue as well. I think I will also get half a minute, 1 minute as well. One basic problem I see as well, although I think it is getting addressed at the moment, is that many people do not link the question of climate with trade and investment and the movement of capital. A lot of environmental movements, especially here in the UK, are still working on silos. So we really have to address that and see the connection, put the connection between climate and issues of the economy, development, you know, policies, economic policies, trade policies. Stephen, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for that. I think we've reached a point now where we can move forward. This was the phrase we're meant to be having a shout out, because there are things that are going on in Manchester which we can get on with as individuals and we can join up with. One of the things, of course, is there's an ongoing campaign to get the Greater Manchester Pension Fund, which is what local authority employees across Greater Manchester have their money in, or their pensions are in, to get that to divest. That's an ongoing thing. Particularly Manchester Friends of the Earth, the people I always think of as leading on that one. The other one is the Climate Emergency Manchester, who've got a petition on the council's website seeking signatures, which is going to, if they get enough, and there's a cut-off date at the end of October, to get 4,000 signatures. At the moment, they've only got they nearly got 1,000, I'm told. Mark Hudson, who is one of their activists, was going to speak, but he's just emailed me to say he's had to nip off for some other crisis. So I would encourage people to look at that. It's not meant to be a way of bashing the council. It's certainly not meant to be a way of bashing the Labour Party, although sometimes it may come over as that. But you know, if you're the ruling party, then you have to carry the can, fairly or unfairly. And it's the idea is that the council would have a 7th scrutiny committee, which would have to look at all council decisions and see if they were fitting their declaration of climate emergency, which they made last year. There was a cross-party motion last year. I think it was carried in MCOM, and it will strengthen the council in if we can get that done. If you'd like to support that, I suggest you look at climateemergencymanchester.net. That's all as one word, apart from the .net, Climate Emergency Manchester. Or if you look, you can search the council's website and find it. And that will enable you to sign up. You have to live, work or study in Manchester City Council areas. So if you live over the hills and far away, I'm afraid it doesn't apply. But if you are in Manchester, I'd encourage you to do that. Now, the last point I'd like to make is a domestic one, and it's an invitation for people to get involved in their local groups, particularly Global Justice Manchester. We've got a meeting coming up this Wednesday. if you'd like to take part in it, it's going to be done with Zoom. Please send another email as you would have done to our web our group email address, and we'll send you the link. And we're going to be looking at what we can do about taking this issue forward. And particularly our focus is going to be on the trade issue because of the urgency of the trade bill. And if you would like something to take away, I'm just going to put in the chat to everybody. There's a link which I only came across after, has it appeared? Sorry, let me try it again. Sorry, which only came about after I had sent it. Is it appearing? Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's I'll put it on our Facebook page of the Global Justice's climate pages have been updated, particularly some actions on that. And we're going to be looking at that. And then the last thing I'd say, this is an advance warning, is note for your diaries, Saturday, 24th of October, Global Justice and I presume other bodies are aiming to have a day of action, particularly on these issues, particularly trade issues. And please look out for that, and we'll be thinking about what we can do for that on Wednesday night after that last. So thank you very much to everybody for this. I'm going to wrap up quite soon. If there's anyone who would like to say anything else, please put a note in the chat right here and now. I'm not seeing anything. It's now after our closure time. So thank you very much for everybody for coming. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for contributions. Thank you to Andy for giving us the historical background, and Dottie for giving us the global vision, and also to Andy for that. And we'll say good night to all. And I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay,
Bye.
closing recording now.